Hi, welcome to Think for Yourself, an introduction to critical thinking. My name is Mark Thorsby, and in this video series, we're following along with a workbook for arguments by David Morrow and Anthony Weston. So I encourage you to follow along and through the series. Now, in our last couple videos, we looked at the question of sources and the types of sources that are generally needed to make a strong, robust argument. Keep in mind that the goal of this course is, number one, to enable you to, on the one hand, evaluate other people's arguments more robustly, but also to make your own arguments better. So there's sort of two different ways, if you will, an internal and an external purpose for all of the different things we've looked at. We've looked at arguments by analogy. We've looked at generalizations. And we've looked at a whole range of things, including fallacies, for instance. Not this one. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 5, Arguments about Causes. Now, that means we're talking here about cause and effect relationships. In arguments that employ cause and effect relationships are effectively arguments about causes. So let's take a look here. Well, we got to start off here. Well, what exactly is a cause? Now, I have to be a bit careful here because the subject of what causality is and the subject of causation is actually the subject of much vigorous debate in philosophy. So I don't want to. So the definition I'm giving you here to start with comes from an important empirical philosopher by the name of David Hume. David Hume talks about the idea that when we postulate a causal relationship between two things, like this causes this, for instance, imagine if I have a cup of coffee, imagine if I drink it and I burn my tongue, we would typically say that the hot temperature of the coffee is what causes the burning sensation, right? Now, David Hume thought that when we postulate these causal relationships, what we're really postulating is what we might call a necessary connection between two different events or two different conditions. And I have here sort of a picture of a domino effect, right? Domino effect is the perfect example where you can see that as one domino falls, it causes the effect of the second domino to fall, which itself operates as a cause for the effect of a third domino to fall, and so on and so forth, right? But that we think of these as being necessarily related, so that when one domino falls and the other falls, right, it's not a matter of coincidence, but we think it's a matter of a necessary connection between these two things occurring. Also keep in mind here that causality and theories of causation are absolutely bedrock essential to physics and to the material sciences. The investigation of the motion of how things move through space, Newtonian mechanics, for instance, all of this assumes that there is such a thing as causal relationships between events. Now, David Hume, I'm not going to go into this. You can check out on my YouTube channel. I have a video posted on David Hume, but David Hume ultimately is very suspicious that it's possible to actually identify any such thing as a necessary connection between events. In fact, David Hume doesn't think we even have the ability, the empirical resources to identify such relationships. Now, we're not going to be worried about that. And then in this video series, we're going to assume that there are things like causes, and our purpose is really about how to evaluate causal arguments. So what exactly is an argument from causation? Well, you might put it this way, is that causal arguments are, number one, they're inductive. And keep in mind, we distinguished this at the beginning of the video series, that there's a difference in forms of reasoning between deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning or deductive arguments are arguments of necessity, whereas inductive arguments are arguments of probability. Now, one of the things important is even though we may think that a causal relationship is a necessary relationship between two things, here is where we recognize that David Hume is right in the sense that we're ill-equipped empirically to identify causal relationships as distinct from merely correlational relationships. And we're going to talk about this here in just a moment. But what we might say is that causal arguments are actually inductive. And why is that? That's because our assumption that there's a necessary relationship between events Well, that depends upon our recognition of the probability for things occurring in the way they do. Again, if you really want to explore this, you really need to go through and do a thorough reading of David Hume's argument related to causality. So even though causation we presume a necessary connection, we're actually ill-equipped epistemologically to identify necessity as such. And so it looks like all we have is that causal arguments are actually inductive arguments. And so that's a really important thing that comes out of Hume. So causal arguments are inductive arguments which provide the premises to support a conclusion about a cause and effect relationship, okay? So a causal argument basically provides you some premises in order to give you a conclusion that has something to do with the causal relationship, some sort of causal effect. Now, let's jump into the rules of reasoning. As you know, this this video series is organized according to these rules of reasoning. Now, let's take a look at Rule 18. Rule 18 is the idea that causal arguments start with correlations. Now, real quick, let's take just a moment here. What is a correlation? A correlation is when we recognize the frequency of instances where two different events or two different conditions seem to go together. So, for instance, imagine every time, let's see here, example, I'm drinking coffee right now. Every time I drink coffee, I also seem to have an experience in which I get a little bit more energy and I get a little jittery or something like this. But if that's all I know, I don't necessarily know that the coffee is what's making me have energy. I just know that the two things seem to occur at the same time, roughly speaking. That is, the two events or the two things here are correlated, but they're not necessarily causally known. Now, we know that coffee has other effects, and so there may be a causal relationship there. But the key here is to remember that causal arguments start by identifying correlations. And that means, of course, that we're talking about induction, right? We're talking about probability. And the idea here is that the only way in which I come to recognize a quote-unquote causal relationship is basically given by the fact that I experience something as repetitiously occurring over and over, right? So if every time I drink coffee I get jittery, right? After repeating that process and that experience over enough times, I will start to expect that the effect of jitteriness is coming from the cause of the coffee. So I'll begin to correlate the two as always being related. Another really straightforward example is for instance, right now you're watching this video. If you click your keyboard, you'll pause the video, right? So that means that you think you're causing the video to stop by pressing the button. Well, why is that? It's that reason because every time you press it, it seems to turn off, and that's consistently correlated. That consistency, that repetitious nature of those events seems to be what builds up this idea of a causal relationship. Now, there's a general argumentative form that is postulated here for thinking about what a causal argument is, and it looks something like this. You have, and this comes from the book, but I've slightly modified it to some degree. It's something like this. The event or condition X is regularly associated with the event or condition Y, right? So here, coffee is the X, and my jitteriness is Y, right? So there's a regular association between the two. And then from that association, I conclude, therefore, the event or the condition X, right, is causing the event or the condition Y. So you can see here, I start with regular association, and then I seem to be moving here to an inference about the causal necessary relationship between the two events or the conditions. So in other words, when we're looking at arguments about causality, what we're saying is that because X is regularly associated with Y in this or that particular way, we're going to conclude that X is causing Y, or X causes Y, right? So for example, here's a sort of simple example. Someone might say, people who meditate tend to be calmer, therefore meditation causes you to calm down, right? So that's a very simple argument that follows this general argumentative form. Okay, so whenever you see, if you will, any argument that begins to postulate these relationships such that, postulate associations, therefore trying to derive a causal relationship, the first thing you should think of is whether or not you can think of a counterexample to that sort of association. That means, is there any case in which y exists, but x occurs, but y does not occur? That would be a counterexample to this general argumentative form, right? In general, what it looks like here, and this conforms fully with David Hume's discussion in An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, namely that correlation seems to lead to this notion of causation. Now, there's more to talk about causation here. In fact, there's a lot more, especially if you wanted to get into something like the transcendental metaphysics of Immanuel Kant, where he tries to understand causation in a more robust sense than just correlation. We could talk about that. We're not going to at this point, because this is probably all you really need to know when you hear these. So, for instance, you hear these arguments all the time. For instance, in politics, frequently people will say things like, immigration is causing the price of medicine to go up. So you'd have to ask yourself, okay, there's correlations between maybe immigration and the price of medical care, right? We do know that every year there are immigrants that come to the United States, and we do know that every year the cost of medicine goes up. But there's a correlation. Does that necessarily mean there's a causal relationship between those two events? Frequently we're accustomed to hearing these causal arguments and sort of just saying, oh, okay, nodding our head. But what you're going to have to do to become a good, solid critical thinker is to begin to shake your head and think to yourself, well, wait a second. You're making an assumption based upon a certain sort of correlation. Is that correlation robust enough to give us the inference that we have a causal relationship? Now, we can identify different types of correlations. For instance, there's what's called an inverse correlation. Inverse correlation means that when you see more of x, you see less of y, right? So as x goes up, y goes down, right? A simple inverse correlation here would be something like, if the average salary goes up in the United States, the number of people who claim poverty goes down, right? That makes a lot of sense. One thing is causing a decrease in another. An increase in one thing causes a decrease in another. Another possibility is to think of things that have non-correlation. And if there's no correlation, it would be very odd to think that things are causally related. So where there's no correlation, we can articulate that there's a lack of causality or a lack of causal relationship as well. Okay, so correlation and causation, these are some of the important things. Now, I've given you a picture here of what looks like some children dancing in the rain, or actually probably in a fire hydrant in New York or something like this. But I want to give you this example because the question of causation and correlation raises for us really a fundamental and really, I think, challenging question. And I want to use rain dancing as an example. Of course, I'm not talking about kids playing in the rain. I'm thinking here, for instance, of the religious practice of rain dancing, in which during a drought, right, a village could call in a shaman or some sort of spiritual guide, who would come and perform some sort of ritual ceremony and prayer typically, and then it would rain, right? And these people became known as rain dancers, and the idea was that when they dance or when they perform their ritual, they cause the rain to fall. Now, we know from science today that rain does not cause by dancing, but think about it for a moment. If every time that a person came to your town and danced, it rained, after a number of repetitions, it wouldn't take many, you would start to believe that they are somehow, in some magical way, causing the rain to fall. Now, notice here, the rain dancing here is a problem, and also other examples of superstition are like this, right? Don't walk under a ladder, right? And things like this. Because what it looks like is we start to see enough correlation, we infer causation, but it's not valid, right? So we know that that dancing doesn't cause the rain, but people in fact have believed this. So you can ask the question, therefore, well, when do we know, for instance, when a correlation simply is just an arbitrary correlation versus it being a necessary or causal relationship? And that question is very, very difficult. I think the gist here is that you need to be skeptical, and that when you hear or read arguments about causal relationships, you should be very skeptical, at least initially, unless it's something where really you have almost irrefutable correlational evidence. Things, for instance, someone says that think about, for instance, when people say something that when you get closer to winter, things start to die because things get colder, right? We have a lot of correlational evidence to suppose that that's true by causation rather than rain dancing. So, interesting example that you need to be thinking about. So, Rule 18, causal arguments start with correlations. So let's move here to Rule 19, and what we're going to look at here is the idea that correlations may have alternate explanations, right? So just because there is a correlation doesn't necessarily mean there's a causal relationship. So these two things are not equivalent, even though it looks like one generates the evidence for the other. They're not logically equivalent. And that's because there may be other reasons for why there's certain correlating effects. For instance, a correlation can be explained in multiple ways, right? There might be different explanations for why you have the correlation. For instance, maybe two events are correlated because they both have the same cause, right? Maybe it's just arbitrary correlation, and so on and so forth, right? Here's a sort of simple example I stole from the book, which is something like, just because the universe is getting bigger doesn't mean that has anything to do with the fact that textbook prices are going up and up, right? We know, at least physicists tell us through their calculations, that the universe is expanding, right? And that means the universe is getting bigger and bigger. And this is happening every day, right? Textbook prices, as you know as a student, and I know as a professor, have been going up and up for a long time. So you see here two things are occurring simultaneous to each other, right? But we would never say that these two things are really well, you could correlate them. They might be correlated in the sense that they both seem to be occurring at the simultaneously, but we would never say that they're causally related, right? And in fact, it's even a stretch to really say they're correlated. They're only correlated in the fact that they're both occurring simultaneously. But the problem is so it's sort of a good example here of where a correlation isn't necessarily going to lead to a causation or even a really firm relationship between two things, both that are happening at the same time, but they're not linked by causation. Okay? Now, what are some of the multiple ways that can explain these sorts of problems in correlation? The first is what we might just call coincidental correlation. Now, that's the example. I think I mentioned arbitrary correlation. Coincidental correlation just means that it's just a coincidence. It's just by happenstance that these two things are occurring simultaneously, or at least occurring in conjunction with each other. Number two, a correlation itself doesn't establish the direction of the connection between the two things, right? So take, for instance, when I say that one event is causing another, then I'm saying that the first event is absolutely necessary in order for the second event to occur, such that without the first event, the second event doesn't occur, right? This is the notion of causation. Now, simply because things are correlated doesn't mean you know the relationship of what's affecting what, right? So correlation itself is not enough to establish the direction of the connection, to figure out what comes first logically as opposed to what is secondary, what's consequent versus what's antecedent. A third possibility is that a third cause might actually be what's responsible for the correlations that are observed, right? So for instance, you can imagine in sociology, in sociology and psychology look at correlation quite a bit. But imagine, for instance, if let's say, I'm just going to make this up, so this is probably not a very good example, but let's imagine, for instance, that you said, listen, in the summer it gets hot, and also in the summer there's more sporting events, right? So you might think that one is causing the other, right? But it could just be the fact of the calendar of when well, I guess the calendar doesn't cause the summer to be hot, right? Or something like this. So my example failed. I apologize. I should cut this out, right? But think about this. You can have two things that are occurring, but they're both being caused by the same thing, right? And that's why they're correlated. They occur at the same time, roughly, because they have a related or connected causal history, though they're not necessarily causing each other. So sorry about that example. Number 4, there may actually be a complex set of causal relations that are simultaneously occurring. So in this fourth possibility, what might be happening is that there's so many different complex causal events occurring that it starts to look like there's two different correlations, right, that are related, when really they're just both the result of a complexity of causal relationships. I think, for instance, analyses of, for instance, economic demographics is a good example. There's lots of different reasons lots of different causal relationships that are simultaneously occurring that probably arise into the way in which we see demographic, economic poverty, and things like this. So there might be a complex set of causal relationships. Now, if you're following along the book, you're going to be working on a brainstorming exercise here. And if you're not using the book, you can, of course, just do this on your own, right? And that is, when you hear a causal argument, practice exploring the different possibilities of explanation that you could think of. So, for instance, take this example. Someone argues there is an inverse correlation between the unemployment rate and the chance of a U.S. president being reelected for a second term. That is, when the unemployment rate is high at the end of a president's first term, that president is less likely to be reelected. Right? So if you take this argument, this person's argument is that the unemployment rate is correlated to the U.S. presidency, right? In different ways. And so now our question, if we're going to evaluate this, is to think, can we think of two explanations for why this correlation would potentially be there, right? Why is there a correlation between unemployment rate and whether or not presidents get elected or unelected? For instance, one example might be that that both of these have to do with a third correlation, that is namely people's personal satisfaction, right? If people are unemployed, they're probably less likely, or when the unemployment rate is high, people are less likely to be satisfied with the status quo. And when people are not satisfied with the status quo, they're probably less likely to vote for a president who represents the status quo, right? The current president. That would be one type of explanation. Another explanation here might have to do with, let's see here. Another example here could be the idea that if this is a silly example, and you can think of all different types of explanation, is maybe when people are unemployed, they don't have a job to go to, so they have more time on their hands. If they have more time on their hands, they can vote, right? And that means that who they're going to vote for? They're going to vote for a president. They're going to vote for something different because they're looking for something different, right? So there's another sort of explanation. In general, it's not that these explanations are necessary. Some are good and some are bad. It's not something, we're not worried about whether or not they're true or not, but you need to get in the practice of exploring new possibilities of explanations. Because when you're presented with an argument and people give you explanations for causal relationships, in order to be a solid critical thinker, you have to be able to think of alternate possibilities. And that's really what this last exercise is about. Okay, rule number 20 is that you should work toward the most likely explanation, right? So that is that when you're trying to evaluate the explanation for where it correlates or causes two different events, or you're evaluating someone's argument that postulates a correlation or a cause, one of the things that's critical is to evaluate, well, what's most likely the explanation? Because there can be multiple explanations given for a single thing. So, for instance, this comes from the textbook. Here's a sort of example. Now, this is a no, so this is a bad example. Imagine someone says, most of my open-minded friends are well-read. Most of my less open-minded friends are not. I conclude that reading leads to open-mindedness, right? Now, this is not a very good argument, and why? This is not a good argument because it fails to explore the relationship between open-mindedness and reading. Clearly, it looks like there's a correlation here, But jumping from just recognizing the correlation to the conclusion that reading is actually causing open-mindedness is too quick. It's too hasty, right? Because remember here is that some people, imagine there's lots of Nazis who read Nazi books, right? They're not open-minded, but they're reading a lot. So that's a counterexample potentially. Now compare, for instance, an argument that's really trying to make the same claim, but does so much more thoroughly. Someone argues, most of my open-minded friends are well-read. Most of my less open-minded friends are not. That should be are not or not. It makes sense that the more you read, the more you encounter challenging new ideas, ideas that make you less insistent on your own. Reading also lifts you out of your daily world and shows you how different and many-sided life can be. Reading, therefore, leads to open-mindedness. Now, I don't know if this argument is really true. I'd like to believe it's true, but you can see it's a better argument. Why is it a better argument? Because here, not only have they identified a correlation, right, they've now also explored the relationship or an explanation for that correlation. And so therefore, this is a stronger argument. If we're going to evaluate it, one of the things I would recommend we do is also consider other possibilities to explain the correlational evidence here, right? But that's a sort of good example here of a good and a bad explanation. And the first one doesn't seem very likely. The second one seems much better, right? So what we can say is that what we want to do when we're evaluating arguments or when we're making our own causal arguments is you want to, one, evaluate multiple types of explanation thoroughly. Number two, you should consider what sorts of things an explanation will leave unexplained. I really like this second one a lot. Why? Because when we have an explanation does the work of helping to explain something else, right? The explanandum. But a single explanation can't explain everything. So one of the best ways to evaluate an explanation is to determine what that explanation's extension is. That is, how far does that explanation extend? What can it explain and what can it not explain? Once I understand what an explanation is unable to explain, then I know the limit of the explanation, and then I'm in a more solid position to evaluate its likeliness, to determine whether or not it really is likely. For instance, the other thing is also don't expect an answer for everything, right? This is one of the problems with people who are conspiracy theorists. They see correlations everywhere, and then the conspiracy theorist goes one step further and not only sees correlations everywhere, they start to see causal relationships everywhere, right? Some things we just can't explain because we lack the sufficient resources to explain their causal relations or their correlational relations. So don't necessarily expect an answer for everything. And simply because someone provides an explanation, always remember that an explanation doesn't necessarily prove it, it only explains it. So not only do you want good explanations, but you want proof that those explanations or the premises in those explanations are actually true. So don't expect an answer for everything. So sort of good dose of humility here. Now finally, rule 21, expect complexity. And I have this sort of picture here of I guess it's a bunch of sticks or something like this. And you can see it's just a mishmash. Things are going everywhere, right? It's highly likely that in the world there's every event causes other events that some events occur at the same time but are unrelated causally with each other. This means that a tremendous amount of complexity can take place. Think about the fact that a forest grows according to the laws of physics and according to the biological mechanisms that are available to it, right? But all of those things occur in an extremely dynamic and complex way. So you need to learn to expect complexity. One of the things generally is that when someone makes a causal argument, if it's really simplistic, it's usually wrong. So expect complexity, look for complexity, and if you don't see complexity, recognize there might be an insufficient or incomplete explanation given. What are some of the things to recognize here is, number one, you should try to identify the relative weight of different causes, right? The idea here is that there's a whole bunch of different causes that can go into play into terms of making a person who they are. For instance, imagine here I am, I'm Mark Thorsby. Now, one of my causes is my genetic makeup, but also consider that my history as a person, the school I went to, the things I've read, the people I've known, all of those things have had an effect on me. So when you're trying to identify you're trying to identify causes and causal arguments, you need to learn to recognize the relative weight of different causes, right? So for instance, my genetics has a very large weight on the cause of who I am, right? So do my parents. But where I filled up my gas tank last week doesn't really have much weight, even though it may have been necessary in the order of things that occurred to get me to sit here at this desk and make this video right now. So you need to identify the relative weight of different causes. Number two, look for the frequency of a causal or a correlating relationship. So for instance, ask how often does this correlation occur? Does this occur with high frequency or with low frequency? Right? Oftentimes the relative weight and frequency go together. Also, you can differentiate major and minor contributors, right? So for instance, if something occurs and multiple causes enable it to occur, some causes are more important, they're major contributors to an effect. Other causes are minor contributors, right? So when we're looking at the world of complexity, we're looking at a multiplicity of causes that occur, or a multiplicity of events that cause other events. And so there's some of those causes are major and others are minor. You might say that you have major and minor antecedent events. Finally, you can also have interpenetrating causes and effects. For instance, sometimes what causes one thing will sort of circle back and create an effect on the original thing. Think here about this example we gave earlier about reading and being open-minded, right? It's likely that maybe you're right that when you read, it causes you to become more open-minded, right? But it could also be the case that the more open-minded you become, the more open to reading different types of books you become. And when you start to read different types of books, you become more open-minded and so on and so forth. So notice here that the cause and the effect can become interpenetrated, or if you will, using a Venn diagram, they sort of overlap, okay? So those are some of the four things to think about when you evaluate the complexity of a causal argument, okay? So that concludes our video today on arguments for cause in chapter 5. I hope that helps you. Thank you for watching this video series, and I look forward to seeing you guys online.